Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel, and today I just wanted to talk about the books that I've been reading this week. The lighting is a bit weird. This is I'm filming this at about 1 p.m. There's not very much natural light right now. Summer is clearly ending. But anyway, let's talk a little bit about some of the books that I've been reading this week, and I hope you're keeping well as well. First up, we have a book that I kind of heard a little bit about and was kind of intrigued by and ended up really enjoying. And this is The Short End of the Sonnenallee by Thomas Brüssig and translated by Jenny Watson, and to some degree as well, Jonathan Franzen had a role to play in it, the author Jonathan Franzen himself. Essentially, this was a book sort of written about the kind of this sort of, basically a novel about East Berlin. And it, for ages, was a book that didn't really have an English translation. And so Jonathan Franzen worked together with Jenny Watson to bring this into existence to the English readership. And it's a really interesting book in several ways. Essentially, it's an East German novel that talks a lot about the kind of East Berlin feeling of the time, but it's this sort of slightly absurdist, comical, silly novel in the kind of tradition of those sorts of poking fun at political figures kind of way. And sort of, when things are so tragic, you kind of have to find humor and comedy in things. So it starts with basically this idea of what the Sonnenallee is, which is this very long road in Berlin, but where when the city was sort of carved up into parts, and West and East Berlin were separated, this one area of the road ended up being somewhat free of that. And so what you end up with is this really small corner of road that's connected to a road that's part of the West, but is East Berlin and doesn't really have another route out. And so it's this very odd sort of geographical quirk. And both the West, people on the other end of the road, and people in the East who sort of know of this road all think that this area is a bit strange and a bit weird. And so that kind of sets up something quite big, and even sort of poking fun at political figures at the time of talking about, the idea that Churchill was too distracted by a cigar to really realise what was happening with the carving up, or these kind of fantastical ideas for what has happened to lead to this geographical quirk. But what we then get is a sort of story of young, I think teenagers pretty much, or sort of young kids working through their life in this. Sorry, these dogs are about to start fighting each other, I think. There we go. One moment. Crisis averted. So what you end up then with is basically a situation where you've got lots of these young kids sort of trying to exist in this sort of odd world. They know to some degree that they live in a slightly weird place, but also if that's your bread and butter, you kind of just get on with it. And the book is sort of obsessed with all these sorts of things that were happening at the time. So there's somebody who's really excited about, smuggling in Western records, and the kind of the music that they listen to has to be done sort of in secret because some of these songs and musicians get banned, but there isn't always a reason given for why they're banned, because that might up the intrigue of why it's important. Sorry, one of the dogs is trying to chew my foot as I'm saying this. And so you kind of have this thing of these characters trying to make their way through when everything else is sort of slightly odd. Things get banned, or they've got to wait in queues for years and for months and months sometimes, what it feels, to get something, to be able to get some of the goods that might improve their lives. But then there's this sort of East versus West thing, and there's a whole thing that our main character Misha is called Misha by his mother because she wants him to sound more Russian. But then everyone around him calls him Mika, and there's this sort of East versus West thing happening just even on his name. So there's all of this kind of thing happening about who he is and who these people are within this odd framework of what it means to be in East Berlin or in East Germany or whatever. But then it's sort of, this book, I think, where it really triumphs is in just the kind of absurdity of it. It will purposely set up, without spoiling anything, there's a whole moment where somebody is more worried about damage to a record than they are about their life. There are people who are to sort of constantly craving the new thing or looking for certain things. And this book really plays in that kind of absurdity and silliness, but uses that to kind of skewer this idea of, one side being right or whatever. It kind of uses that to play with political allegory in a really clever and fun way, I think. Next up, a very different book, Push Process by Jonathan Walker. And this is a really interesting book, I think, because it's half photographs, or the second part of the book, I should say, is photos. It's which is relevant to the plot, because essentially we are following a young man who is a photographer, and he is taking various pictures of Venice. But in all the time with him being there in Venice, he sort of sees the kinds of various ways that, being a young sort of 20-something or whatever, and kind of trying to strike out as an artist and kind of to have this artistic vision, and all of these discussions about what it means to be an artist compared to some of the realities of living, or compared to interpersonal conflicts or whatever. And so we sort of see him kind of build up through his life of just sort of trying to get along and trying to make things happen, but with these sort of philosophical moments of what does it mean to create art, what does it mean to see something, and he has this sort of kind of constant monologue about the changing nature of Venice as well, and people around him are telling him about a new building or something moving and changing, and what it means to see a city and to be there. And that's kind of part of his photography. So the novel proper finishes at the end of part one in terms of the actual writing, but then you have this sort of bit at the end that is just these black and white photos of Venice. And there's something really, and there are some photos sort of sprinkled in to the main body of the text as well, but there's something really fun and inventive about this. And although, I didn't always maybe linger on the photos as much as was probably needed for the book, there's something kind of special about the way that this book almost tries to break that, not fourth wall, but that idea of you're reading a textual piece, you're reading a novel, it's a thing of words, but actually here is a picture that a character could have taken or that is directly relevant. And I thought there was something so fun and playful about the way this book achieves this. Next up, I read A Girl Returned by Donatella di Pietrantonio, and translated by Anne Goldstein, who is also the translator of the Elena Ferrante books. And I couldn't work out at first why her name sounded so familiar. But anyway, this is a really sort of spare and kind of haunting little book. It's a young girl is basically in the middle of the night is sort of taken away from her home and sent somewhere else. And she has to adjust to this new life of these people who sort of become her new de facto siblings, and, just sort of living her life around them, and kind of these sort of regular questions of who am I, who's my family, where do I belong, how do I adjust to this, who am I angry at, all of these sorts of things. And there's something really interesting about the way this book sets that up, of these discussions of her real frustration at the things around her, but also this sense of sometimes when people write teenage characters or young characters well, I think is where they really capture that whole state of being of when you're quite young and everything feels both like the most dramatic thing, but also everything's unsure and uncertain. You don't really know fully what's happening, and you don't really have the experience under your belt to be able to call it like it is. And I think this book really plays on that by then having this character also be the one who sometimes sees through various things, but we also, without spoiling anything, as we come to realize increasingly in the book, she's been lied to quite a lot, and a lot of the things that she's been she's been lied to about are these really big things that, and she's treated as if she's not big enough to be able to understand them. But equally, she is a character who, probably more than a lot of the other characters in the book, can actually shoulder some of these things. And so we get this really sort of bizarre, not bizarre, kind of this sort of quite convoluted sort of set of twists almost of, is this thing true? Is this person lying, or is this person lying, and blah, blah, blah. And I really appreciated the way this book brings that into kind of this discussion about just childhood and what it means to have all of these things happen to you at a specific point in your life. Last but not least, and on a very different tone entirely, 1984, the year that pop went queer, by Ian Wade. And this is a book that, non-fiction book that looks at a very specific period in music, so 1984, and what was happening, particularly in the UK and around the pop charts of the time. And I really liked this as a way of extrapolating out into having wider conversations. So although Ian Wade is talking about a lot of singles and big songs and albums in 1984, a lot of those artists would have either had longer careers leading up to that, or this was the launch of them, or they'd maybe only become bigger later. So we get people like Culture Club, Elton John, George Michael, you get kind of big records and whatever coming up. And all of this is to sort of pinpoint this moment that we've got lots of very either queer or kind of queer adjacent figures appearing in music with often very androgynous looks or music, and all of these are happening at the time sort of together. You know, there's this sort of, you know, we've got people like Freddie Mercury and Queen having sort of a certain period in their career where they're maybe in a bit of a dip or kind of rising up again at the same time as all of these other people. The washing machine is now going haywire, as you can maybe hear. Apologies if it's really noisy. But all of these sort of figures from pop music history are all happening around the same time. And I think this book is really interesting for sort of charting where their rises and falls happen, and how this one year, or kind of the period just around it as well, really is this sort of point of convergence of a lot of big moments in pop music, but also in queer representation and what that's meant. And also I think by dint of doing that, we see the kind of tragedy behind a lot of these people. So someone like Pete Burns, we see then a sort of how this is his big moment, and actually because of personal circumstances and other things, he sort of drops off the radar a bit musically, and then all these other people are kind of rising and falling. Someone like George Michael later has his whole, you know, being cottaging kind of let's go outside kind of thing. But actually in this moment, he's not necessarily out. And so we get this other kind of conversation about this is really when a lot of the queer rights movements and kind of queer representation is really growing. And so this fascinating moment is kind of captured in this book that I really greatly enjoyed. So those have been the books that I've read this week. I hope you're keeping really well, and I hope you have a great week. I'm gonna be on holiday before too long. There'll still be a weekly reads at the end of next week, hopefully. But yeah, I'll be sort of in and out. So there'll be some sort of videos sort of filmed in advance. But anyway, I hope you're keeping well. Have a great time and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.